I slowly turned away from Nietzscheanism as I discovered the work of Slavoj Žižek. Žižek was very, very influential on me because he was the first very serious philosopher, aside from Nietzsche, who I could say I truly understood. And for some reason, I felt like he almost came easy to me. And he's like one of the only philosophers who really comes easy to me in that way for some reason. I don't even know why. I think it's mostly because he is very much into the whole philosophy of subjectivity thing. And that is my whole thing. That's how I came into Orthodoxy.
So that was something that you were interested prior to reading Zizek?
I wouldn't even say that, actually. Well, I guess I was, because as I was saying, I started off trying to write some sort of Nietzschean philosophy of consciousness, right? So philosophy of subjectivity from a Nietzschean perspective. And I realized that the stuff Žižek was talking about had real value. And when you go on YouTube, there's very few people who can explain that side of Žižek very well. There's lots of good stuff on his politics and his social theory and stuff on ideology. But the core of Žižek, as he himself says, is his philosophy of subjectivity and his understanding of Hegelianism and all this stuff. So frankly, I think that there's some other videos on YouTube about this, but really the only videos that really will explain exactly what he means by stuff like the subject and object that I've come across are either my videos or Žižek lectures. So that's another reason why I really got into Žižek, because I was like a big YouTube guy, and I'm still less of a reader and more of a listener, because I paint houses for a living, and then I just listen to lectures and stuff. So I was listening to hours and hours and hours of Žižek, and finally it just started to all come together. So basically from Žižek, I realized that there are certain contradictions and paradoxes in his philosophy that are much better explained by Orthodox Christianity. And honestly, I don't even remember when I first discovered Orthodoxy. It had to have been from YouTube. Actually, now that I think about it, it was probably from Jay Dyer and his videos.
Many such cases.
Many such cases. There's like 5 or 6 people at my own parish who discovered Orthodoxy through Jay. Basically, I realized that the Žižekian understanding of the subject has certain deficiencies, which, due to their very deficiencies, pointed towards Orthodoxy. And that's when I started looking into Orthodoxy, and I discovered someone named Seraphin Hamilton, who is now a friend of mine and a very, very brilliant man, especially when it comes to biblical stuff. And I never really had a difficulty accepting the existence of God. It took me like a month or two just because of Seraphim, and he demonstrated the coherence of the Bible. And to this day, in my opinion, the most convincing argument for Christianity is the coherence of the Bible and the way Jesus fulfills all of these Old Testament threads. And not just in the sense of there's one verse in the Old Testament that is already quoted in the New Testament, and then you just, when there's some Jewish or atheist objection to it, you're just like, well, see, Jesus fulfilled this. It's more like the entire story that the Old Testament gives you is fulfilled in Christ in a very, very rich and meaningful way. So I want to become better with the Bible stuff, but that's how I became Orthodox.
Do you want to unpack the link that you saw between Žižek and Orthodoxy?
Sure. This is something I've talked about before and I've talked about in videos, and I'm actually, with the person who runs my channel, Nate, we're writing a book right now on, it's called Anagogia, that's the working title, and there's going to be 4 chapters, and each chapter is using the works of a particular philosopher and reading them from an Orthodox perspective. And the second chapter, and also the chapter that we've basically finished, it's the only one we've really done much work on, is the Žižek chapter. So with Žižek, he understands the subject as this void of a self-relating negativity. That's the term he uses. And what he means by this is that the subject, in the sense of the I, like who you are at your core, can't be reduced to any of your subjective experiences, like your phenomenological experience. So in this sense, he's like very much contrasted with Heidegger, because for Heidegger, Dasein is this being who can never be separated from its life world, and it's always and it makes no sense to speak of a Cartesian subject for Heidegger. But for Žižek, he takes more of the Hegelian route of emphasizing negativity and saying that Heidegger misses the negativity of the subject, and that negativity is the withdrawal. And for Žižek, the subject is nothing more than a withdrawal. So it's this pure act of withdrawing from all its objective content. So it's phenomenal experience, and therefore it's nothing more than this cut in reality. So you couldn't.
So he's saying that after you strip away everything that you kind of feel you know about yourself and you're experiencing, that then you reach this.
Exactly. And in his book Hegel and a Wired Brain, he actually talks about how there could be a situation where this subject becomes fully manifested, and that is when in the wired brain, or in the singularity or whatever, however you want to understand it, but the way Žižek understands it is your subjective experience gets merged with some sort of collective mind, or you can share it with other people, and then your own subjective experience no longer is your own, right? Because it's been lost into this collective hive mind. But what Žižek says is that even if you lose all of this objective experience, or subjective experience rather, the one thing you can't lose is the void of your own subjectivity as the I. So what will happen is this frankly, very scary prospect of you losing all of your thoughts and yet nonetheless remaining this individual completely stripped of all of what you previously considered to be your inner life, your life world, and you're nothing more than remaining as this void.
It almost sounds Buddhist.
It almost does, but I think the one reason why it wouldn't be Buddhist is because I think the Buddhists would want to go the route of saying that even this I is lost, right? Yeah. And what Žižek says, that would be like the Buddhist void, and that is the void of peace, right? It's like the egoless bliss. But Žižek has this very famous quote in Less Than Nothing, where he says that there is no peace in the void, or something like that. So for him, even the void itself, the way he understands the subject at this level, the level of a pure withdrawal, well, it is like a Hegelian negation of the negation. So you start off with nothingness, right? Because consciousness for him isn't some material object. It's nothing, but that very nothingness is negated, right? So you're the nothingness of consciousness is negated, and that negation of the negation positivizes itself as the subject. So it's nothing more than a nothingness which is turned back into itself, self-reflected, to use Hegelian terminology, and then become real for itself. So I don't like to explain.
How does it do that then?
I couldn't tell you. That's the thing. I couldn't tell you. This is one of the things, like I'm less and less worried about the way people think about how smart I am and stuff. Like back in the day, like I didn't even want to ask questions like that. Like, how does that happen, right? But at some point you got to ask, well, how does something come from nothing, right? And I don't think Žižek can really explain how reality just emerges from the void. I think this is just a classic philosophical problem that all of his admittedly very genius speculations just misses, because maybe it's just a little too genius for its good, that it lacks common sense, right? So basically what I realized is that this void of self-relating negativity, this nothingness, which is a positivized nothingness of withdrawal, is synonymous with the Orthodox Christian understanding of hell. And that was the big moment for me. Reading right here, Pavel Florensky's The Pillar and Ground of the Truth. This book really, really changed the way I understood Orthodox theology and the value it could have, because it's so philosophically informed. It's he was very well read on people like Fichte and Hegel. And nonetheless, I would say, even though he has slight deviations probably from the patristic understanding of certain topics, I would say generally he was quite faithful to the Orthodox tradition. And he, in the book that we're reading right now, I literally take quotes from Florensky and just put them side by side with Žižek, and I'm like, listen to the way Florensky is describing the abyss of Gehenna, and then see the way Žižek is describing his own subject. And these are the same in every single way, and it's not just a superficial language similarity, but it's a similarity in the very structure of the way they're parsing it out. Like for Florensky, he talks about how the subject in hell has barred itself from communion with all others, right? Because it's this abyss of this withdrawal into the self, which is what St. Maximus the Confessor calls self-love, right? So through self-love, you break communion, because self-love is the opposite of love. And we can understand self-love as pride, or however else you want to put it. But and there are multiple Orthodox saints who say that the essence of all sin is pride. Right. So like, and that's why St. Paisios once said that the only thing God wants from you is humility, because in the same way that the essence of all sin is pride, or the failure to enter into communion, a withdrawal from God, the essence of virtue is returning back into communion with God. So Zizek's subject as this withdrawal, it's like he describes it as like separated from its empirical content. This is exactly what Florensky says. He talks about how when Christ talks about our works that we do, this is referring to our empirical self that we develop and grow over time. And true freedom is having a proper hierarchy of your empirical self, and then yourself as a free subject, and then God. And it's meant to be this hierarchy of communion. And then to fall and to sin is for your empirical self, your free self, the subject, to become lost in its own empirical content and become enslaved to the passions. Okay. Right? Yeah. So losing its freedom in that way. And I don't know if I can do justice to Florensky, everything he says. I want to do like a proper video where I write out a script for this, but basically through this becoming lost to the passions, you actually are further alienated from yourself as the image of God, and you become lost more and more in your own subjectivity to the point where you're nothing more than this void. And Florensky talks about how, like, for him, it's like a pure I equals I. There's no possibility for encountering the other. That's what I was going to say. The subject in hell has withdrawn from all communion, and in doing so, it's no longer capable of interacting with otherness. So it's stuck in this monotony of the self same. And that for Florensky is hell. The abyss of that is hell. And Žižek himself talks about how he has this quote that I love where he says, the most radically new thing is not to discover an alien, but to say, screw it, another self-consciousness, right? Like just to say, oh, there is an other out there who's just as absolute, just as singular as me. Because when you're understanding subjectivity in the self-relating way that Žižek does, there is no possibility for truly encountering the other because you're trapped in your own self-relation, right? Okay. So the way Žižek understands this being trapped in your own self-relation and your own autonomy, basically, is structurally identical to the way that people like Pavel Florensky and Dimitris Staniloy as well talk about the subject in hell. So that connection between Žižek's subject and Gehenna, the way it's been parsed out, notably in the works of Florensky, Staniloy, and C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce, that really helped me connect the way these two seemingly completely different traditions.
Well, in Zizek's philosophy, then, how would he say that you could genuinely encounter another?
I don't think he believes you can.
Oh, okay.
And this is something I don't think he ever really accounted for, and I tried to account for it in Aphesis. There's this and for anyone watching, if you want to not buy the book but hear about this, Chad Haig on his channel did a overview of it where he actually explains it like a lecture. Mm-hmm. So you can check that out. If I'm sure at face value it probably won't make that much sense, but basically the way he understands the subject is, of course, as a self-relation, and because of this, it's sort of like an absolute singularity that has to be more universal than any other particulars it encounters. And in order for these particulars to be encountered, they have to be brought within the universality of the subject, right? So they have to be in some way diminished in their own singularness, because two universalities can exist at the same time for Žižek. Mm-hmm. But of course, within an Ontology of Communion, two singularities can exist at the same time. In fact, in God, three singularities exist mutually interior to one another. So I don't know if he ever talks about this explicitly, but the way I interpreted Žižek and the way I sort of tried to develop his concepts in Aphesis, I came up with this term perspectival hierarchy. And the idea is that from your perspective as a subject, you have to be the highest point within a hierarchy, and there's no content to what you actually think you are better. So it's not like you encounter others and it's just like in a very vulgar narcissistic sense, you're like, oh, I'm better than these people. But it's your very experience of yourself has to be more universal than the others that you encounter. So you necessarily, as a structural feature of experiencing other subjectivities, you have to undermine them and delegitimize them in some sense to make them less absolute or singular than they actually are. So very briefly, actually, in Aphesis, the main idea that I came to is that the subject is, there are three impossibilities of subjectivity. And the first is the impossibility of self-knowledge. And I think this one's pretty easy to grasp because if you are a subject, say I'm a subject viewing reality. In order to see myself, I would have to jump behind myself to see myself, right?
Right.
It's like an eyeball trying to see itself. But that within a self-relating conception of subjectivity, that's impossible. So that would be the first impossibility of subjectivity.
I think someone like Bill might say, but who could know me better than myself?
Right. And that's I think that's true in a sense, and I actually do think that's true within this conception, because even if no one else can know you more, that doesn't mean you know yourself, right? Because or even if no one can know you more, that doesn't mean you know yourself. So I think that is probably what Žižek would say. He would just say that this point of the subject, this cut in reality, no one knows, right? It's just this eternally lost object. That's what he actually equates the Lacanian object A, which is the lost object of desire, with the subject itself. Because for Lacan, you're always looking for an object that's never there. This is the lacking object, which is object A, and that's why desire can never be fulfilled, because what you're searching for is never actually there. And for Žižek, the subject is the object of desire, because we're always trying to find ourselves, but we can never find ourselves. And actually, the nihilistic reality for Žižek, and I maintain that he is a nihilist, is that you can never find yourself, because you aren't actually there. You're nothing more than this sort of positing of a negativity, a positing of a positivization of nothingness. So what you were saying with how you know yourself more than others, that could be true in a certain extent, but I don't think for Žižek it applies to the void of the subject. And then when it comes to knowing others, that would be the second impossibility of subjectivity, which is the impossibility of intersubjectivity, which, as I've already discussed, because the subject is barred from the other as this self-withdrawal, it can never actually commune with the other. So that is the second impossibility, which is the impossibility of intersubjectivity. And then the third is the impossibility of absolute knowing, or just the impossibility of reconciling with yourself and just becoming what you are. And by that, I mean, in every single day you wake up and you're something different, and you've negated what you were before. And this was a tricky one for me, because I'm like, isn't this creativity of becoming a newer self part of the beauty of life and the joy of life? So would it be something good? Like, we could say that it would be probably a good thing to know yourself, right? And a good thing to know others and commune with others, but would it be good to just stop developing?
And someone could also say that that whole timeline of you constantly changing is you.
Right. And that's the thing. That's another thing I wanted to get at, because, and yeah, I'll do that in a second. That's a great point. Basically, well, now that I've laid them all out, something I realized when I was nearing the end of the book is that, okay, we have three impossibility of subjectivity: the impossibility of self-knowledge, the impossibility of intersubjectivity, and the impossibility of absolute knowing. But isn't it true that at the same time, the three essential elements of being a subject is self-consciousness, knowing yourself, consciousness of others, and so intersubjectivity, and then maintaining an identity over time? So it's almost as if the subject cannot be what it truly is. And that's where I started to make the connection between the conception of subjectivity and the fall. So, because the fall is like a fall into not being able to be what you truly are, which is being in the likeness of God, which is being in communion with God and other people. So there is, of course, an identity over time, but at the same time, there's this negativity which breaks us from what we were before. And I've come to the conclusion as a Orthodox Christian now, with working within the Orthodox Christian theological tradition, that this isn't necessarily a bad thing. This is a good thing, actually. Development is good, but there is a time when we will find rest in what we are. And that rest is nonetheless a sort of antinomic unity of rest and movement, which the Church Fathers, or specifically Maximus the Confessor, calls the ever-moving rest. So it's a perfect communion with others that solidifies yourself as what you are, so you've attained what you desire, but nonetheless, because God is not only infinite, but beyond infinity, he keeps giving to you, and you can continuously move deeper and deeper into the life of God for all eternity. So it's sort of a movement that is not powered by lack, so it's therefore not desire. And basically what I realized when I realized that the subject, what I was basically describing was a fallen subject, I started making the connection between Christianity. And it wasn't until I discovered the works of Demetrius Staniloy that it all came together when he started talking about the subjectivity of God and the way God knows himself. And the key component that I was missing the whole time was understanding communion and the ontology of communion, because when you try and think within a self-relating conception of reality, you can never make sense of these. Everything remains a paradox, and you run into contradictions because you're trying to describe something that isn't actually real. Reality is communal, and any self-relation is just is sin, and sin is a parasite on what is always already good because it is created by God.